Our first speaker is Chris W. Surprenant of the University of New Orleans. He is Associate Professor of Philosophy. He received his PhD from Boston University. He's also director of the de Tocqueville Project on Law, Liberty, and Morality, which examines enduring questions in Western moral and political thought. He's also the author of Kant and the Cultivation of Virtue. He specializes in the history of philosophy, moral philosophy, and political philosophy. Other panelists offering brief reactions and comments are Ryan Getty, Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice, Sac State, and Timothy Hauk, Instructor of Philosophy at Sac State.
First off, thank you all for being here. This, for me, is perhaps the most important contemporary topic in applied moral and political philosophy that we could be addressing. And by that I mean not just the ethics of policing, which is what this conference is focused on, but all of these questions related to policing and punishment, generally wrapped up in this idea of criminal justice reform. And so, I mean, I guess I could get a show of hands, but how many of you think that, sort of broadly understood, that the criminal justice system in the United States is generally broken or otherwise greatly in need of some sort of major overhaul or major repair? Either because, thought, yes? Okay. Either because of things that we've seen where it seems like you have, say, disproportionate sentencing based on an individual's economic situation or race, or other issues with, say, policing generally. We've all seen the videos. These are really important issues. And one of the things that separates, say, this issue from other issues in philosophy, because I think one of the criticisms that we get in philosophy is that a lot of times we're not dealing with real-world issues. We're not seeing how the ideas that we're looking at can actually be applied to contemporary problems. One of the things, though, that we see with criminal justice issues and trying to achieve some sense of criminal justice reform is that this issue is a political problem in ways that other problems aren't. And what I mean is that a political problem is one that can be solved by us as individuals. If you look at how criminal justice is set up, if you look at from the beginning, where we set up what the laws are, we identify the laws, we come to some agreement on these rules, and we assign punishments. And then all the way through to where we figure out how, after individuals have been punished and served their time, and we figure out, well, what are we going to do with them now that they've either re-entered because they've come out of prison or they've paid fines or whatever else. We're making the decisions all along the way. We get to decide at every single stage how we should respond. We get to decide what the laws are, we get to decide what the punishments are, we get to decide how those punishments are policed, we get to decide what happens once the people fulfill or carry out their punishment. It's one of the few areas that you see a problem, such a significant problem in our society, that we are almost in complete control over how to address it and possibly how to solve it. Compare that with other problems that, say, connect to, say, resources. So I'm from New Orleans. We had a little bit of a water problem a couple of years ago in New Orleans. We usually have water problems, and that's a natural resource problem. We can't prevent a hurricane from coming and hitting New Orleans, but we can prevent, or we can at least think about why the Orleans Parish, where the city of New Orleans is, up until 2014, we had the highest per capita incarceration rate of any parish or county in the United States. You're not from New Orleans, but we can think about, sort of as a community, why it's the case that the United States, with the exception of the Seychelles Islands, has the highest per capita incarceration rate of any nation in the world. We can think about these questions and they have political problems. And so what I want to do today is think about some of the philosophical problems, some of the ethical issues underlying the various stages of this criminal justice process. From the very beginning, where we think about the creation of laws, through policing, which is what this conference focuses on, and then through punishment implementation, and then what we do with people after they've been punished. Because if we're thinking about this philosophically, if we're thinking about the principles that underlie this issue, it's not just about, well, let's look at how we police. Let's look at how we go about, what our relationship with the community is, or when we think that we need sort of tough policing as opposed to, say, sort of more gentle community policing. We have to go through this entire thing in terms of thinking about why are those laws in place, what are our aims with policing, and so forth. So what I want to start off by thinking about is why do we create rules and why do we punish people to begin with? And I think the question that we need to look at, or at least the two questions, are the ones that I have up here. So I think if we want to understand how we've gotten to where we are and how we go about addressing, say, the political problem associated with criminal justice reform, we have to think about at least three questions. And here are the first two that I'd like to think about. Is what is the appropriate or core value or core values of civil society? What are the things that when we think about what we value and why, and we think about the ranking of those values, what we put as the highest and what we put as the lowest, or how it works out? Because how we value certain things, like individual freedom or security, and how we rank those things, or when we're willing to make trade-offs, let's say, between freedom and security, is going to affect the types of laws we implement and how those laws are enforced. But second, the other thing that I want to think about, at least at the beginning, is what is the appropriate role of the government? Because if we think that the appropriate role of the government is to keep us safe, right, that is the most important thing that the government should be there to do, that's going to lead us to very different conclusions about criminal justice and criminal justice reform and policing and punishment than if we believe that the appropriate role of government, the number one role of government, is to, say, protect rights. Those are very different things, or could be very different things. Now, obviously, we want to try to maximize all of these values in some way, but it's one of these questions, when push comes to shove, what do we value? Where do we rank things? So let's think about this first one. When we think about core values of civil society, one of the things that we could think about is this distinction between liberty or freedom and stability. And we just had an election in this country, and we find out every 4 years that people sort of disagree on a lot of important topics. But one of the ways to set this aside or set this up is to think about where do you fall, or where do the people in our country fall on this spectrum of valuing freedom or valuing stability. And here I use liberal and conservative as sort of small L liberal and small c conservative. And I'm not thinking about, say, political parties, because I don't want you to associate necessarily, say, people who are liberal, sort of small L liberal, with Democrats, and say, conservatives with the Republicans, because it's not entirely clear anymore that the Republicans are actually conservative in sort of the real sense of the word conservative, and it's not clear that the Democrats are actually liberal in sort of the individual freedom sense of the term. But think about where you as an individual fall on this spectrum. That if you had a choice between valuing, say, freedom or stability, do you sacrifice certain amounts of stability for freedom? Or do you say, well, I'm willing to give up certain amounts of freedom to achieve a greater sense of security or stability? I mean, one of the obvious places to think about where this comes up is, if you go to the airport and you're going through the TSA line. So I was traveling yesterday. I'll be traveling back to New Orleans later today. Every time I go through the TSA line, I think that what our country has decided is that we would rather have a greater deal of stability or protection or security, giving up some amount of liberty, giving up some amount of freedom. And again, this is a decision, or where you fall on this spectrum is going to be an individual decision up to you. But again, the issues related to criminal justice reform are political. In this room, if I gave you this chart and I said, look, show me with a dot where you fall on this, and I give you, say, a couple of different questions. We have, say, 100 people in this room. We would probably have 60 or 70 different dots on that line. And so one of the questions is, if we're thinking about, say, criminal justice reform, if we're thinking about policing, we're thinking about issues related to punishment, do we value a greater degree of freedom, or do we want stability? How you answer that question is going to in many ways determine where you come down on some of these issues. But there was a second question. So one was, what is the appropriate core value of civil society? And again, it might be a false dichotomy between liberty and security, but keep that in mind for right now. The second is, what is the appropriate role of the government? So there are at least two options we can think about here in terms of the appropriate role of the government. And again, this is not set up in some sort of US political spectrum. This is the philosophical distinction between perfectionists and anti-perfectionists. So individuals who believe that one of the functions of the state is to make people better, and I don't just mean morally, but that we have some set of core values, some set of ideas, even things like good health, right? That we see the government, even in our own country, creating laws all of the time for the purposes of making people healthier. So New York had the soda ban for a while. We do things like create extra taxes on cigarettes, or we otherwise try to discourage unhealthy behavior. On the other side is that we can remain neutral, or the government can remain neutral on some of these issues related to what it means to live well. And again, this is not there's no right answer to this question. Right? This isn't, well, you know, Chris from the University of New Orleans is going to try to tell you that really what you need to be is sort of a perfectionist and a conservative or whatever else, but rather that when you look at this spectrum between liberal and conservative in our country, and again, not political parties, but valuing liberty or sort of stability, and when you look at this spectrum between what people think the role of government is in terms of should it try to make people better through the laws or should it not, this is going to determine how these conversations take place. And again, since these issues related to criminal justice reform are political issues, one of the ways to have the conversation with someone else is to figure out, one, where you fall on these spectra, and then two, where the other person falls. Because one of the things that I noticed, and I imagine you did too, when I asked how many of you think that there are criminal justice problems in this country or that we need criminal justice reform, is that nearly every hand went up. The problem is that probably none of you share the exact same beliefs when it comes to philosophical orientation for the state or personal beliefs in terms of morality. And so if we're going to actually achieve sort of real reform, I mean, this is not just a philosophy conference, right? We want to do stuff, right? We want to actually accomplish something. You have to figure out how to have these discussions with individuals who have significant philosophical and political disagreements on important issues like these. So some of you who have seen two separate spectrums before on a PowerPoint slide know what's coming up next, is that it's not so much that we have, you know, two spectrums, but rather we can see four different quadrants of individuals, and these quadrants kind of determine to a certain extent how you're going to come out or how you're going to fall on some of these issues related to policing and punishment. So someone who, say, is a liberal perfectionist, so someone who believes that what we need is a maximization of freedom, of individual freedom, but also believes that the appropriate role of the government is to help direct people towards better things and away from things that are harmful, is going to have a very different view of what the laws should be and how we punish someone than someone on the opposite side. Right? Someone who, say, is a conservative anti-perfectionist, someone who believes that what we should be valuing is stability and that it's not the appropriate role of the government to get involved in these questions. And again, because this is a practical political question, if you're interested in bringing about real change, whatever you think that real change, positive change amounts to, you have to figure out, how can I talk with people who hold significant philosophical views on these issues? So I know some of you are in philosophy classes here. I think it's important to actually talk through what some of these views are. I heard that the conference last year was focusing on nudging. Is that correct? I got it right. So are some of you here at the conference last year on nudging? Yes, okay, so I see some head nods, good. So if you're a fan of nudging, right, what you believe, and nudging is the idea very briefly that what I can do is help people make decisions in ways that are sort of minimally coercive. So think of if you own a all-you-can-eat buffet, right? So let's say you own an all-you-can-eat buffet, and what you're trying to do is motivate people to spend or not eat the more expensive items. So if you've been to Las Vegas, this would be those snow crab legs. What do you do with the all-you-can-eat buffet? How do you position your food? Yeah, you put things like the pizzas and the pastas at the front, hoping people would load up on those before they get to the more expensive items. The same can be true if we're trying to direct people to healthier choices. So what we can do, and what we've seen through empirical research, is that if you set up, say, fruit at the beginning or low-fat yogurt or something else and, say, a breakfast bar, people are going to load up their plate with that, and when they get time for the hash browns or the bacon, there's not going to be enough room left on the plate. And so you can kind of steer people towards what is best, while at the same time recognizing that those people are free moral agents and are able to make the decision for themselves. So it's not as if you take away the decision, but rather that you kind of nudge them towards making a better decision. Joseph Raz, who's a political philosopher who wrote The Morality of Freedom, argues for a more direct approach. He doesn't believe that in order to be free, you need to have access to all available options, but rather you just need to have access to an adequate range of options. And so another way of thinking about this liberal perfectionist position is that what the state could do is remove bad options, right? Take away bad behavior, but still allow people to choose between a range of, say, better to worse. But someone who believes that is going to be very different from, say, a constitutionalist, someone down at the bottom right. So someone like Randy Barnett, who is both a conservative in the sense that we value stability, right? So someone who supports, say, original interpretations of the Constitution. And here I mean like genuine interpretations of the Constitution, not where someone says, well, look, here's what I want to do, and I'm going to see if I can get the Constitution to say what I want it to say. But someone who takes a traditional view of the Constitution and believes that, say, the fundamental principles underlying the nation or underlying the state really shouldn't be changing all that quickly. So someone who believes that and also believes that it's not the appropriate role of the federal government or any sort of government to direct people towards what is better or worse, again, is going to take a very different view towards punishment, towards what laws we create. That person is not going to want to, say, implement soda bans or suggest that what we need to do is nudge people towards what is better or worse. And they're not going to use punishment to do this. One thing to mention also is that it's not just, say, contemporaries that hold these views. We can see these views throughout the history of philosophy. In the introduction, it was mentioned that a lot of these ideas will connect back to some of the earliest thinkers. And so someone like Aristotle, how many of you have read Aristotle's Ethics or Politics? Okay, Aristotle is probably going to be into that either the top left or top right, depending on how you view him. So one of the views that Aristotle holds is that one of the functions of laws is to make people better morally by getting them to repeat good actions over and over again until they eventually internalize that behavior. And so again, you can decide whether or not you think that's the appropriate role of the state to do that. And I'm not making any judgments today about what the appropriate function of the state is, but rather that, one, it's important for you to identify, say, where you fall on this chart, and it's also important to identify where other people fall and how then you're able to communicate. Because again, if the goal is actual criminal justice reform, and not just philosophical discussions where we have our discussion today and then we leave and we think about something else, we have to figure out how we can talk with other people who hold fundamentally different views about the ranking of freedom as opposed to stability and the appropriate role of the state. Because if we don't figure out how to have that discussion, it becomes like what we see on TV with these talking heads, where they argue for 20 seconds back and forth, they leave, they pat each other on the back, and nothing gets done. Or what gets done is really bad, which seems to be the case right now. So before I suggested there were two questions, right, going the wrong way here. What is the appropriate core value of civil society and what is the appropriate role of government? Let me suggest that there is one more question related to creating rules and assigning punishments that I think is the most directly relevant to some of our issues and problems in criminal justice reform. And it's that question at the bottom, which is to whom do the rules apply? To whom do the laws apply? And I think there's sort of an obvious way of tackling this question. We can say, look, everyone is equal under the law. The laws apply to everyone equally. And people can raise certain concerns about whether or not there is an equal application of the laws in the United States. That's a straightforward question. But I think there's another way of looking at this, which is to think about when people implement laws, when legislators create rules that we're supposed to live by, who are those people creating the rules for? Are they creating the rules for themselves, or are they creating rules for other people? I think this is a really important issue. When you think about playing a game, one of the things that we think about is that I'm going to create rules, or that we're creating a game with rules that everyone's going to have to follow. It's a very different game. It's a very different situation. It's a different ethical situation if we think about creating rules for other people. And I think one of the concerns that we should think about in how we approach criminal justice right now and how we have the laws in place at the moment is that it may be the case that the people creating the laws never believe that those laws are going to be applied to them or the people who live around them. This is a problem. Now, I'm not saying that that's always the case, but rather that's a philosophical question that we need to ask. One, are the rules being applied equally? And then two, when people are creating the laws, do they intend those laws to apply to themselves? And I think if you answer that second question, no. If you say that right now what we have is we have a system of government in the US, either at the local level or at the national level, where people who are creating laws see themselves as distinctly different in terms of the groups they belong to or the community that they belong to, as opposed to who those laws are ultimately going to apply to, that's a type of issue that can be addressed. That's a type of philosophical question that underlies some of these issues related to policing and punishment. But at this point, let's move on from this discussion of laws and the creation of laws and the role of the state to the issue that, one, the conference is focused on, but I think is very important, which is this issue of policing and some of the philosophical questions underlying issues of policing. So we have criminologists, we're going to have an attorney later today. They're going to talk with you further about how we've gotten into the position that we're in, what's the appropriate sort of response to police, and so forth. And I don't want to address those things now, although I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A if you've got questions. But rather, what are the philosophical issues underlying policing? So some questions, and again, there are lots of questions, but some of them that came to my mind immediately is something like, well, why do we need the police? So one of the analogies I drew a couple minutes ago was between the laws and games. And if we think about the laws as a game and we think about the police as, say, the referee of a game, why do we need referees in games? And there are lots of different answers that we can give. Right? It's because that people are, if you follow Thomas Hobbes, people are self-interested. And what they want to do is take advantage of other people. And so one of the reasons we need referees is to enforce the rules. If you're sort of less pessimistic about human nature, you may say that one of the reasons that we need referees is that people commit unintentional fouls. Or they foul and there's some dispute about whether or not it's a foul, and so what you need is a neutral third party to decide if a rule's been violated. That's why we need referees in games. I think. Any of you play Ultimate Frisbee? Do you play it competitively? I mean, this is like the participation part of the talk. No, do any of you play Ultimate Frisbee competitively? No one? Well, then I can make up anything I want right now. No, but one of the things about Ultimate Frisbee tournaments is that there are no referees. It's supposed to be a self-policing game. And one of the comments that I made to a student, and again, this is not to disparage anyone who plays Ultimate Frisbee, but the reasons why perhaps they can do that is because maybe the games, there's not enough at stake. Can you imagine an NFL game being officiated by the people on the field? Or an NBA game being officiated by the people on the field? One of the things that we need to ask is, well, there's an important difference between games and people living in our society. Why do we need police? What is their function? Is it just to protect folks? Is it to, again, this is going to go back and you're going to get tired of this, perhaps. But it goes back to how you answer this question. Because if the role of the police is just to, say, enforce the law, that's different from the police, say, trying to make people better or trying to keep a sort of consistency throughout social practices. And how you answer that question is going to depend on, what you think the appropriate role of the police are. Another question that you could think about is say, are there better ways to police? So a very simple thought experiment to give you an idea of what I'm thinking about in terms of philosophical issues here. Imagine if the police in our society operated like the fire department. The police didn't drive around the neighborhood. They weren't actively looking for crimes. They weren't actively trying to do whatever the police in your community do. And I don't say that to be flip. What the police do in different communities is different depending on what they've been asked to do. But imagine they operate like the fire department. You have a police station. The police don't leave unless they're called. How does that change what policing looks like in America? Does it change it for the better? Right? Because we don't have the police, say, pulling people over for speeding. We don't have the police, say, used as a revenue generation device, collecting parking tickets or whatever else. Or does it make America worse in some way? Would there be rampant crime? Would people say, try to get away with things that they otherwise wouldn't get away with because they knew that the police were, say, over there and I'm operating over here? I mean, these are important ethical questions, philosophical questions. Some of them have empirical solutions. But others, let me suggest, relate to what you value in terms of your political beliefs. And again, not political as in political party. I'm saying that a lot, but it's really important, especially after an election where we've sort of picked sides in some way. But political in terms of what you believe is the best way to order society. And so how you fall is going to depend on again, this chart. So after policing, when we think about what laws we police and how we police them, after that comes, how we're going to implement punishment. And for me, this is perhaps the most important philosophical question. What counts as just punishment? What is the aim of punishment? Why do we punish? And it seems like such a simple question. Why do we punish? Right? I can punish my dog when he, say, rips up the baby's toy. I can punish my 2-year-old when she does something we don't like. I can punish my friend when we were supposed to meet up at the bar and the person stood me up. I can punish a lot of people. What's the point of it? Let me suggest that there isn't just one answer, because I think if we polled everyone in here and said, well, what's the aim of punishment? What's the function of punishment? I think some people, when we start talking about the criminal justice system, would say that the primary aim of punishment is vengeance, that someone's done something wrong, they've harmed someone else, and we need to get some sort of payback. Anyone agree with that? Yeah. This is not an unpopular, so I'm from New Orleans. Right? You know how Louisiana votes on things. I asked this same question of people in Louisiana, and pretty much every hand goes up. Right? That's the aim of punishment. We throw them in jail. We do nasty things to them. They've done something bad, and they need to suffer as a result of it. But there are other reasons for why we punish. Right? And so say an explanation that's vengeance, or say perhaps the nicer way to think about that, so not vengeance, but retribution, right? They've done something wrong and they need to suffer something that's equivalent. That's a backward-looking view of punishment. It looks at what has someone done in the past and how can I address that? But there are other ways, if we're thinking philosophically about punishment, that we can address punishment. And one of those is to think about forward-looking ways of punishment. Oh, we've got a little bit of problem on the slide. So we've got a backward-looking and forward-looking. If you think of how it lines up, the retributive is backward-looking. Those three over on the right are all forward-looking. So we can think about deterrence. We can think about some sort of restorative justice approach. We can think about how punishment communicates things to other people in society. Those are all forward-looking. The easiest one to think about is deterrence. The reason why I punish someone, the reason why I punish, say, someone for stealing is because, one, I want to deter them from stealing in the future, but also I want to deter other people around them from stealing in the future. Simple approach to punishment. And it also means that if someone commits a crime and there's really nothing you can do in terms of a response to deter them from acting that way in the future, if you take a strictly deterrent view of crime, you would think that punishment in those cases is not justified. So let me give you an example. My guess is that everyone here believes murder is wrong. That's a very bold statement. And what I mean by murder is, say, the intentional killing of another person. Now, all of you sort of immediately are thinking of exceptions, which is good. Imagine you're shipwrecked and you're hanging onto a plank in the middle of the ocean, and someone comes up to you and tries to grab onto it. And so what you do is you take your fist and you start, beating them until they, fall to their death. In some sense, right, you've murdered the person, right? You've intentionally killed them. But what sort of punishment could society implement on you that would have made it unlikely for you to act in that case in that way? Is there any punishment that we could have threatened? Death? Well, certain death if you don't push the person off the plank. What I'm suggesting is that if you take a deterrent view, a solely deterrent view on punishment, what you're doing is you're not looking backwards at what has happened. You're looking forwards. And if there's no way to, say, deter that action, deter that bad behavior, then punishment isn't going to be justified. When we take a philosophical approach to punishment and how we respond to bad behavior, there are very few people who would only say that one of these things is the reason why we punish. I imagine you're sitting there saying, well, look, it's important that punishment have certain retributive elements to it. It's important that punishment have certain deterrent features. It's important that one of the things that we do when we punish someone is we're communicating to that person and we're communicating to the people around them that this is bad behavior. And so one of the challenges in philosophy right now, and where there's really no good answer, right? So unfortunately, I am not giving you some answer to a difficult question. I'm saying there is none, is how we combine these multiple different approaches to punishment or multiple aims of punishment in a way that's satisfying. So perhaps the most developed view of punishment in the history of philosophy was presented by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Some of you read Kant's theory generally? Yes? I see some head nods. Good. So Kant's generally recognized as a retributivist. And one of the reasons why he believes that retribution is central to punishment is because the role of punishment in society and what allows us to keep civil society together. So what Kant argues is that the reason why civil society works, the reason why we can all be here and not worry about each other killing each other or the laws just functioning as we would expect, is that civil society is a condition of mutual respect and recognition where everyone is morally equal under the law. Again, we all have differences in strength and intelligence and other things, but we're all morally equal. It means the law applies equally to everyone else. And the reason why civil society works is that through my actions, every action that I perform on a daily basis, I am showing to you, I'm communicating to you that I also believe that I'm morally equal to every single one of you. So what happens when I break the law? What I do when I break the law is I say that I'm making an exception to the rule. For whatever reason, I think that I don't have to follow a general rule that everyone else has to follow, but you do. And in the moment where I break the law, what I'm doing is I'm saying that I'm no longer morally equal to you. And Kant argues that under those circumstances, civil society can't operate. And so what we need to do is we need to punish the person. Because if you imagine everyone in a condition of moral equality, at the point where I say I'm going to break the law and make myself an exception to the rule, I'm putting myself above others in society in terms of moral equality. What punishment has to do is it has to bring me back down to that level with everyone else. So punishment's retributive, punishment, retribution focused. That's what happens when you can't say a word. Punishment focuses on retribution, and what you need to do is punish someone in a manner that's equal to whatever crime they committed. The goal isn't to send that person below everyone else, but to send the person back to this level of equality. But even Kant argues that what's important, in addition to punish being retributive, is that punishment also deters future bad behavior. So the argument or the example of the person sitting on the plank is from Kant. So he says that in those cases, there's nothing we can do to punish people, right? Because any sort of punishment would not have deterred that bad behavior. But also that punishment has to be communicative. That one of the things that Kant argues that punishment does is communicates publicly that someone is responsible for their actions. So the only way civil society works, the only way that condition of moral equality works, is if I believe that all of you are rational beings capable of moral decision-making and you're responsible for your behavior. And so what happens if you do something bad, you perform a bad act, and I don't punish you, I don't hold you responsible? What I'm doing is I'm saying that you're not an agent. You're not responsible for your behavior, but if that's the case, if we have individuals who aren't responsible, if we don't hold them responsible, if we make exceptions, Kant believes it's not possible to hold together that condition of civil society. So that position may sound persuasive. The problem is that I don't know how, and this is coming from someone who studied Kant for a while, I don't know how you reconcile a position that says, look, we have to hold people responsible publicly because that's how you recognize them as moral beings, and recognizing them in this way is important to maintain civil society, and then also say, well, look, there are certain cases where punishment isn't going to deter bad behavior, and so let's make exceptions. It's not clear how you can reconcile those. There's been a lot of work in the history of philosophy and contemporary philosophy to try to come up with so-called hybrid theories of punishment, ones that try to combine different aspects of these views. So far, none of these have been entirely persuasive. They all have the same practical problems that you're probably thinking through right now. Is, well, how do I decide when to say prioritize retribution over deterrence or communication or something else? Because it's not necessarily the case that all of these can work together nicely. So if you're interested in, say, the philosophy of punishment or in theories of punishment, or even thinking about how to come up with an appropriate scheme of punishment that's internally consistent, this is one of the philosophical problems. Just how do I reconcile these different views? But there are also practical problems, right? So one of the questions is, how should we punish? And there are lots of different ways to think through this issue. So right now we use two main mechanisms of punishment in the United States. There are some outliers, but the two main mechanisms of punishment are incarceration and fines paid to the state. Every once in a while you hear about someone who has to walk up and down, say a median with a sandwich board on them saying that they were a liar or a thief, but generally it's incarceration, fines paid to the state. So one of the things that we want to think about as an underlying philosophical problem is, are there better ways to punish? Are there other things we can do to, say, accomplish those aims of punishment, but do it in a way that, say, isn't as destructive to our society, doesn't allow people to profit off of incarceration, doesn't allow people to profit off of the supposedly bad behavior of other people? Because one of the things we heard about, if you were at one of the talks yesterday, is that once you create financial incentives to, say, lock people up or to arrest them, you're creating a situation that inevitably leads to this condition where perhaps too many people are locked up, which is what we have right now. So one of the things that I wanted to show you, because I think a lot of people, if you think criminal justice reform, there are two issues that I think people say, talk about immediately. One is the role of police and just policing and possible police brutality. The other is mass incarceration. Show of hands, who thinks mass incarceration is a problem in the US right now? Okay. This is what got me started in this issue a couple of years ago when I started in criminal justice reform. As I mentioned, I'm at the University of New Orleans. We're a public school in New Orleans. A lot of our students come from the background where they have friends and family members who are being arrested, who are being incarcerated. And this is a problem. In many cases, they're justly being incarcerated. In other cases, it's not as clear. But when I started thinking about this, I thought, well, look, really the solution to mass incarceration, perhaps in New Orleans or generally, is really what we need to do is get all of those people who are in jail for possession of drugs, just let them go, right? I imagine most of you would agree with that. If you're in jail for simple possession, that seems to be not appropriate. And I thought that's the solution to the problem of New Orleans and incarceration in New Orleans. And then I started looking at the statistics. We don't incarcerate anyone for possession, for the most part. So if you think that the solution to the problem is getting all the people out who are in jail for possession, you don't incarcerate anyone for possession, that's not going to work as a solution. Turns out in New Orleans, our biggest problem is violent crime. So the majority of people in prison, vast majority, are there for violent crime. So what do you do? How should we punish individuals who are guilty of violent crimes? And I have no good answer to that question. And what I have is even more depressing than that, which is, if you weren't depressed to begin with, is that when we think about mass incarceration, we think about this as a national problem. And the way I framed this discussion at the beginning suggests that it is one. Right? I said, we incarcerate more people per capita than any other nation in the world with the exception of the Seychelles Islands. That would suggest that there's some sort of national incarceration problem. But that's not the case either, for the most part. So this is the only graph, the only statistics I'm going to put up, which is the relationship between how many people are imprisoned at the state level, at the local level, and the federal level. So let me ask you to focus on the federal prisons just for a second. This is that yellow on the bottom. What you can't see, so there are 211,000 people. If you want this chart, just shoot me an email, I'll send it to you. It'll be higher resolution than this. But what's important to see is that of the 200 and so thousand people in the federal prisons, about half of them are there for drug offenses. So what President Obama could do on his last day of office is just pardon all of the people in the federal prisons who are there for drug offenses. Maybe pick and choose, maybe some are there we don't want, whatever, right? 105,000 people are there. We have 2.3 million people in our prisons. Getting rid of all of the federal drug offenders, do some quick math, how much that is? A little under 5%. Now, that would obviously make a significant difference in the lives of those individuals and their families, but in terms of addressing the mass incarceration problem, it doesn't. When you look at state prisons, it's also a very small amount of people in there for drug offenses. And the problem is that when you start looking at state prisons and local jails and you see why people are incarcerated, the situation changes depending on where you look. And so my other depressing bit of information is that I don't think it's going to be possible to come up with, say, a national approach to this issue. It's a localized approach. But it means that people like you, right, so you're from this community, you can find out why are people being incarcerated, what is the problem with the community, and you can perhaps address it. Let me point your attention to one other statistic, which is the local jail statistic. So as the end of 2015, we had 646,000 people in our local jails. Over 2/3 of them, 451,000, were people who have not been convicted of anything. They're sitting there. It doesn't mean that they're not violent offenders. It doesn't mean they're not threats to other people in the community. It just means that they haven't been convicted of anything. So one place to start if we're thinking about taking a significant chunk of individuals out of this issue, again, if you think mass incarceration is a problem, are those people who haven't been convicted of anything. But again, the philosophical question is then, well, what do we do with them? What's the appropriate way to punish someone? And again, that's something that has to take place in discussion because it's a political problem that gets resolved by all of us. Lastly, I want to talk very briefly about life after punishment. This is perhaps, if not the most important issue for these individuals who get incarcerated, but it's important if we're thinking about the community. Because once someone's done something wrong, and we've all done something wrong, right? There was a book published not too long ago called 3 Felonies a Day. That we've all committed 3 felonies a day just by operating and doing the normal things that we do. Some of us get arrested, others of us don't. But what do we do with individuals who have been punished? Normally we focus on things like voting and restoring voting rights to people who are convicted felons. That may be important. Talking with a lot of these individuals, they don't care about voting. What they care about is, can they get jobs? Can they get back into the community? How are they treated by other people in the community? How do we treat them? And again, those are philosophical questions, right? How do we approach people who have broken the law? How do we approach people who have broken the rules? How do we approach people who have, say, done their time? How do we address them? And then what the appropriate aims of punishment are in terms of reducing recidivism. But most importantly, what is our society? How do we approach punishment generally? How do we approach policing generally? So what I wanted to do today, and what I hope I've done today, is given you an idea of what the central philosophical issues, or what some of the central philosophical issues related to criminal justice reform are, going all the way through from why we create laws, how the laws are created, through policing to punishment, and then ultimately to get us thinking about what to do with folks who need to come back into society, who have done something wrong. Because, again, if you take nothing else from this issue, you take nothing else from this discussion today and all of the other panels, recognize that one of the best things about the problem with criminal justice in the United States is that it is an entirely political problem. It can be solved by people. It can be solved by us in ways that there are a lot of problems that we're dealing with in our society that can't be solved just by us. Problems related to the environment or other things related to the natural world. Those are much more difficult in a certain way. So I hope that's something to be hopeful about, and something that, as the president of this university suggested, would encourage more dialogue. Because if you believe that the only way to solve this problem is through dialogue, then what we have to do is figure out, how do we get people who have significantly different philosophical and political views, how do we get them to talk to each other and ultimately get them to arrive at the conclusions that I think we all think are the most just? Thank you very much for your attention.
We'll first have brief comments from Ryan Getty, maybe a question or two.
I like that. I kind of take it from can y'all hear me? This Texas accent. In the 80s and 90s, criminologists there was some traction on why there was overcrowding, and then it became mass incarceration. And Ryman came up with kind of a theory of the rich get richer and the poor get prison. And that's actually the title of the book. And it pretty much comes out and says that the laws are made by rich, white, male, usually lawyers, to, I'm sure I'm not using his words, but to kind of keep down the lower classes, and then the police are left to enforce and keep that order. Is there anything in philosophy, since I'm not familiar with it at all, that would kind of also equal that?
So I think there's an empirical question, right? Who is creating the laws and why? Philosophically, look, my concern is that if we take the view that legislators are racist, police just want to lock people up, and so forth, I don't think we get anywhere. I'm not suggesting that's what but I think that's one of the things that we think of, and you get a lot of philosophers, academic philosophers around the table, and they say, well, look, the laws are racist and the implementation of the laws are racist. And look, there's certainly some truth to that in certain places. I won't deny that. But I think there are other issues at play in terms of what we should be doing and why. And I think without trivializing the issue of race and as it comes to policing and punishment in the U.S., without trivializing that, because I think it's an important issue and important question to why we are where we are, especially in certain communities like New Orleans. Look, people like me aren't getting arrested in New Orleans for some of the things that other people are getting arrested for. But I think if we just focus on that, I think we lose sight of some of these bigger issues. Because I think even if you got the issues of race out, you're still going to have a lot of the problems that we have now. Doesn't mean you don't address the race issues, but you're still going to have a lot of the same problems. So I can't speak beyond to the empirical claims, but I think when you look at some of the ethical issues, I would want to look beyond some of the racial issues, not because the racial issues aren't important and aren't relevant, but because even if you address those, I still think you've got other problems. And I think solving those other problems may address some of the race issues as well, so in terms of empirical results.
I agree. And now from Tim Howe.
So thanks so much for that talk. It's really interesting. I especially appreciated the part about getting clear about our core commitments. Just a few days ago, I was having a discussion with a friend of mine about politics and how we should govern, and we realized that we had some pretty fundamental. He ended up explaining that he's almost an anarchist of sorts. He thinks the most important value is freedom and non-interference, and so that sort of trumps everything else. And once we got clarity on that point, the conversation took a different turn. So I think it's really clear to make sure my students get tired of me saying this, but that we're not talking past each other on these issues, and those underlying commitments are really important. I was really interested in you really briefly talked about who are the lawmakers creating the laws for. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. I thought that was really interesting because I suspect none of the lawmakers think they're making it for themselves. And there's a great essay by C.S. Lewis called The Trouble with X. And the idea is we think everyone else, when they do something wrong, they have some character flaw. But in us, we've got some excuse. And so really we're creating these laws for just these problematic people with these character flaws, but it's not for us. But I was wondering, although I think that's an important question, I was wondering if you think or have any suggestions about what might be changed if the lawmakers are asking this question. So supposing, I think it's important and it's sort of problematic if lawmakers are just making laws with other people in mind. But does that have a practical import, or do you think it makes a difference, or is it just kind of in principle important?
Yeah, this ties in very nicely to the comment about Plato earlier. So one of the things that we see in Republic is that it's really important for rulers to rule and be ruled in turn. And so if you have people who always believe that they're creating laws and that they're not the people who are subject to them in the same way that others are, and that they're never going to be in a position where they're subjected to these laws, you get a different types of laws, different sets of laws that get created. Now, in terms of, say, empirically, because, and this is going to be me speaking out of turn a little bit because I'm not a political scientist, but there are a lot of empirical sort of suggestions that we could look at to try to remedy this, say, ethical or philosophical problem. Things like term limits would be an obvious one. Something that I've sort of played around with is thinking about selecting representatives by lot. So this is choosing people at random from the community in the same way that people are, say, selected for jury duty. So permit me a very brief thought experiment. Imagine if it were the case in your local community, if all of your representatives, senators, national representatives in the House, and people locally, and I don't mean people who we think need to have specialized knowledge, so say judges or positions like coroner, positions along those lines, but people who are supposed to represent the will of the people. Imagine if they were selected by lot, drawing names out of a hat. How do you think it would change the community? How do you think it would change how we approach other people? How would you think that it would change something like how we approach public education? This is especially a problem in my community, that I would be terrified if this were to happen, in part because I know that there are so many people in my community who aren't up to the level where I would want them to be be able to think through these decisions, right? So maybe on my case, right, the reason why I would be terrified is because they have different sets of values, or it's because perhaps their educational level isn't what it should be in my eyes. But maybe that would motivate me to fix that. Maybe that would motivate me to have conversations with other people about what they value and why. And it would also motivate, I think, someone who gets selected, right, to know that they're going to be putting laws in place that people in their community are going to have to follow. It may be someone from the other side who gets selected. So if if you've done any political philosophy, you may be familiar with John Rawls. And one of the things that Rawls talks about in his theory of justice is the veil of ignorance, that in terms of making just political decisions, one of the things that you have to do is imagine that you're implementing laws or making decisions for groups of people and you do not know what their nature is. You don't know their education level, you don't know their race background, you don't know their gender, you don't know their economic background. What laws would you put into place? And I think, I think there are problems with Rawls's position. I don't want to, leave here with you thinking that I'm a Rawlsian. But I think there are a lot of benefits to an approach like that. And I think that can address some of these problems that you're referring to. At least if, in theory, it addresses some of the problems. Now, whether it would work in practice is something different. But I even think that it not working in practice and that it goes horribly, horribly wrong would mean that we would take other practical steps to remedy those things in the future. I think one of the things, and again, I promised myself I wouldn't talk about the most recent election, and now I'm going to break this promise to myself. If you think that the most recent election has gone horribly, horribly wrong, one of the things it allows you to think about is how can we avoid putting ourselves in this position to begin with next time or again? So you may start thinking about the limits of executive power. You may start thinking about, well, how is it that we elect people to certain offices? Those are really important conversations to have, and we don't have them now. And it sometimes takes, say, selection by lot with bad people selected, or an election that you don't think goes your way, to really sort of shake people and get them thinking about what values are important and how we should proceed. So if you're super depressed by the results of the last election, take some comfort in that it'll allow you to think about these values, allow you to think about how we can move forward in what I hope would be a productive way.
At this point, I'd like to invite you, if you're to register your interest in asking a question in the conventional way, and I will find you. Also, I'd like to encourage you, if you have some time, to follow this link or use your handy QR reader to fill out a very helpful survey for us that will ask you a few questions about the presentation. But where's my first question, please? Thank you.
Hello? Do you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so you started off with making a comparison to natural disasters and how we handle situations like that. And you said that this is a purely political problem, not like reacting to a hurricane where we have full control over all steps of this program. It doesn't seem to me that it's a completely political problem because much like a hurricane, policing is kind of like reacting to crimes that are made. So we have control over policing, punishment, and all those steps, but we don't have control completely over the crimes that are made. So we can kind of control that through core values of society and whatnot. So, values of society are different 50 years ago than they are today. So there's some control over that, but they certainly aren't fully within our control. And we can't really predict how they're going to go, and it takes a lot of effort to make those things change. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that, because it seems like the values that kind of lead to crimes are just as out of our control as sometimes as hurricanes are or natural disasters. And policing and punishment are kind of responses to those in much the same way that reacting to a hurricane is.
Yeah, let me start by saying that it's a political problem doesn't mean that it's easily solved, right? So just because it's a political problem doesn't mean that it's not easily solved. And it's certainly the case that the actions of everyone beyond myself are outside of my control. And so everyone beyond you, right, the actions are outside of your control. But that doesn't mean that the actions are not outside of someone's control. And it really depends on what your view of, say, human nature is. I don't believe that anyone wakes up and says, well, look, today I'm interested in murdering someone. Today I'm interested in robbing someone. Today I'm interested in going to prison. Maybe we've created a certain environment where those things are possible, but everyone wakes up saying, look, I want my life to be better than it was the day before. And so when we think about why people commit crimes, again, I'm not a criminologist. We ask the criminologists why people commit crimes. But I think we have answers to those questions, at least hopefully, or we're thinking about it. And I think we can address some of those issues. I don't want to, if we say, look, crimes happen by chance. People are going to do things that are just, people are just random actors. If you take that approach to individual actions, you're going to come up with a very depressing view of human society and what we have to do. So it may be the case that you're right. It may be the case that there are actions that are beyond the control of the actors who are performing them, and that the vast majority of people who commit certain crimes, they really couldn't help themselves, and they're not responsible in the way that perhaps you're suggesting. I just don't want to view human nature that way. And maybe that means that I'm not practical. But if you view human nature that way, your approach to punishment and policing is going to be very different from say, mine. But that's okay, because what we need to do is then you and I would sit down, we would identify the principles that we have in common, and we would try to figure out, even given, say, random actors, what should we do? Right? That conversation can still take place. And what I mean to say in that it's a political solution is that even if you and I have radically different views of human nature and what causes people to act in certain ways, we can come up with a solution to the problem. Maybe we can't prevent crime, but we can prevent all of these other bad consequences that are coming after it. That's what I mean to suggest. I don't think we'll ever get to the point where there's no crime. Right? If you have kids, you know that kids break the rules all the time. Right? You're never going to prevent them from not breaking the rules. Adults break the rules. People do stupid things. You're not going to prevent that. But what's in our control is also then the responses to that. And some responses seem to be terribly unjust and lead to sort of a snowballing effect on problems, and others don't. And my suggestion is, because it's a political problem, you can isolate how bad things get even after someone's committed the crime. Like, after someone's committed the crime, how we respond is up to us.
Hi. So in regarding the reasons for punishment that you brought up, you talked about how it's just a small fraction of drug offenders, and that trying to release all the people who are in prison for drugs doesn't necessarily solve the problem. But it seems to me that there needs to be a paradigm shift, not in why we punish people, like in instances such as drugs, but how we punish them. So if we look to countries like Norway and Sweden, whose prisons are shutting down because they don't even have enough prisoners, and you look at the way they treat the prisoners within the prisons, you find that there are much lower rates of, it becomes an effective deterrent, as opposed to here where we find there's a lot of repeating offenders that happen. So do you think it would be more beneficial not to focus on necessarily who we lock up, but how we treat the people that we lock up?
Yeah, of course. And I think that one of the things you can do is I think the range of punishments that we have in this country right now, and I think it's primarily, putting people in jail or having them pay a fine. Right? I think once you start expanding our approach to punishment and how we punish people, then we can start to identify, what we should be doing with certain individuals. So if I put my cards on the table on some of these issues, it's, as far as I'm concerned, if someone's only harming themselves, if they're doing drugs or whatever else, that does not seem to be an appropriate crime to punish someone for. Now, if someone wants to get medical help or whatever else, we can give it to them, but the punishment could be, say, medical help. I think one of the challenges, though, of when we start looking at other nations like Norway and Sweden and say, well, look, this is what Norway and Sweden do, and yes, what they're doing is successful. You have relatively wealthy, relatively homogeneous societies that have similar views on a lot of things when it comes to morality and just sort of cultural values. I think probably the conversation that, say, takes place in this room, if most of you all are from California and most of you are college students, is going to be a very different type of conversation in terms of what should be done than if you started bringing in people from New Orleans, if you started bringing in people from Detroit, if you started bringing in people from other parts of the country in terms of what should be done. He's left now, but there was someone who was here earlier, and we were talking about appropriate punishments to crime, and African-American man, and here I was standing against the wall, basically taking a position similar to yours, that look, we have too many people in jail, and he looks at me and goes, they've got to pay for what they've done. Whoa, okay. And he was right, and his position is consistent with a lot of views in this country. So I think part of the challenge is, in practice, is how we come to some agreement, given the diversity of views. But yes, I mean, if you're asking me, I think that you start punishing people for, things where they're only harming themselves, incarcerating them for that, fining them for that. I think it's completely inappropriate, and it's counterproductive in terms of what we're trying to achieve. But I think there are bigger problems here. Again, we've got a significant number of people in jail for drug reasons. So I don't want to say that it's not significant. But just letting all those people out does not address the mass incarceration problem. It goes a great deal. I mean, it's a good first step. But we've got to think about what to do with people who are, property crimes, violent offenders. And perhaps we need to look at other alternatives for those individuals as well.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I thought you really nailed down some really fundamental questions that we have to ask ourselves when we're approaching these situations. I just had a small question, which was, do you think that it's reasonable for us to assume that the decisions and conclusions we come to regarding these questions are actually representative of maybe the real values that we would have when faced with actually dealing with the situations that we would deal with coming and confronting these issues, maybe in public, in person, in positions of power, and so on and so forth? When theorizing now, would the conclusions about our values actually be representative of those values when we face those situations in the world?
So the philosopher Mike Tyson said, this is Iron Mike, that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? And I think one of the challenges of doing philosophy is that we can sit around and we talk about what principles we should adopt and what sort of procedures we should follow in theory, and then in practice something happens, and it's like, whoa, let's react to it. And so in terms of, I would like to say yes, right? That because otherwise something like this is a waste of time. Because if we're spending a lot of time thinking about what we should do, and we all sit down and we have some sort of reasoned understanding of this is appropriate, this is not appropriate for drug offenders or whatever else, and then all of a sudden we get someone who then fits into the categories, and we go, well, this person's an exception. Let's do something different. You know, then what's the point? And I think the challenge is that a lot of these decisions are being made by individuals who aren't participating in these discussions in any meaningful way. They are made by people who have certain political incentives or financial incentives. And I don't want to suggest that that's there's nothing, say, immoral about that. People respond to incentives all the time. I respond to financial incentives. I respond to certain types of political incentives. I respond to certain types of social incentives. But we have to understand that the people who are making the laws and the people who are setting what the penalties are, they're also responding to similar incentives. And so one of the philosophical discussions that we could have, and we had an economist here yesterday who talked about the militarization of police, one of the discussions we can have is about these incentives. What can we put in place that when we encounter something, that when we have an actual example, do we have the mechanism set up that can deal with this appropriately to take advantage of form like this or other reasoned discussions? Because if at the end of the day we don't even follow what we do when we think through it, right, then we're like what Mike Tyson's opponent is, right? And there's a concern about that, right? Because you want to be reactionary. But I think that being reactionary and not thinking about what has gotten us to where we are now has kind of put us in this position where it's very tough. If you think about, say, like a ratchet, it's very tough to go down once you start putting stuff in place. And so I think we need to think carefully about why we're there and think carefully about how to undo that, and then actually follow through with that. If we don't, then we're not going to resolve the problem that I think all of us see as here.
Hello. Oh,
Hi.
thank you for the talk. I did also enjoy it. My question will remain on the topic of values. I was going to ask, is it not also an important part to notice the strength in which we hold those values, where in making laws, or they may not think that they're making them for themselves, but someone may hold a particular value, like a perfectionist value, with a very high degree of strength concerning the mass majority of people, but perhaps to themselves hold an anti-perfectionist value. And I'm particularly concerned with the strength in which people hold their values, because if it's an important part of society to ask these questions that are, integral in solving the issue, how can it be possible maybe to have these discussions with people who hold values so strongly that they cannot compromise, or perhaps are so inconsistent in the strength in which they hold their values that they cannot make consistent decisions in regard to a particular policy?
That's a really good observation. I think the only thing that you can do for those people or in those cases is to reduce things to some sort of empirical discussion. Let me give you an example. So let's imagine that you are very strongly in favor of allowing women to decide whether or not they want to abort their unborn child. And let's say that I am very strongly on the opposite side. It's not immediately obvious how we can have a productive discussion, right? And this is part of the problem in this country. And so I'll yell at you about how you're murdering babies, and you'll yell at me about how I'm impinging individual freedom, and murdering babies might be strong, but there's a certain truth to both sides of that issue. So I think one of the ways you have a discussion like that, and so one of the ways that you would say, we're about to have Thanksgiving, right? And you're going to go and talk with your family, and perhaps some of you will be smart enough to avoid politics, but others of you won't because sometimes it's unavoidable, is to reduce it down to an empirical discussion. What is it that the person who, say, is the religious conservative, what values does that person share with the young, non-religious, liberal Democrat, however you understand that? What values do they share? They share certain values, depending on those individuals. And I think it's a matter of identifying the values in which they agree, and then saying something along the lines of, again, not to take this back to abortion, but that's just such a controversial issue, right? So some people take this view that look, it's not a living person up to a certain point. That ends up being some sort of empirical discussion. As soon as you and I can have a discussion about, say, facts, then we can either look it up or we can turn to the criminologists. That's kind of the secret about how to get around, say, difficult moral issues. Because I'll never get someone to agree. So someone who believes that drug offenders should be locked up for life, I'm not going to get that person to agree or find any common ground if we stay on the issue of drug offenders. We've got to move off that issue to some sort of principle discussion first, figure out why is it that he or she believes that drug offenders should be locked up for life. And then once I identify what the principle is that the person holds, then I build us back up through some sort of empirical discussion. Okay, so you believe such and such. Well, if I could show you that such and such, would you change this view? Or how would that alter your view? Now, there are some people where they hold certain beliefs, and no matter what evidence or what reasoning you present them with, they're not going to change their view. It's impossible to really work with them. But I don't think that the vast majority of people operate like that. Everyone, for the most part, I have these sorts of ethical conversations with people all the time as part of my job. I've yet to find anyone that is unwilling to have any sort of discussion and is completely inflexible on sort of every single principled issue. Like that just, I haven't found that. It doesn't mean they don't exist. But I think that if you can figure out how to get that principled discussion take place and then work it as an empirical issue, I think, and I think that's kind of what's happened. So even if you look at the research on something like how we value or our approach to, say, same-sex couples in this country, there's been a pretty dramatic move over the last, 20 years in terms of public policy. But just because there's a dramatic move in, say, public policy doesn't mean that you've changed people's opinions, some other people. What they found is that what changes those people's opinions, say someone who firmly believes that entering into this type of relationship is immoral, what has changed those people's positions is that they end up knowing someone, a child, a friend, that has these interests. And that's that's empirical facts that can change it. So, one of the things that I would do, or I would suggest that if you're trying to have some sort of difficult moral discussion, is to try to reduce it to some sort of factual discussion and say, look, if the facts were like this, would that change your views? And I think then you can make some progress from there.
Hi, thanks.
Hi, yes.
Could you say something more concrete about how policing models work in, maybe for the interest of time, a couple of those quadrants on your graph? Like on the street, how do police behave differently if you're located, say, in the perfectionist liberal quadrant versus conservative anti-perfectionist quadrant?
Oh, okay, yeah, that's, so I think so I'll need to think about the actual empirics in terms of how do people go about policing. But you would look at the laws on the books, right? So if you were a perfectionist conservative and you believed that the appropriate function of the state was to direct people towards better and worse behavior, and you also believed that what was better for the state in terms of the well-being of others is some sort of stability in terms of cultural values and whatever else, you would probably see a lot of laws on the books that were akin, some of the SOTA laws or laws prohibiting same-sex relationships or whatever else. And so what would policing look like in that situation is it might be a little bit more invasive. Because what you want is it's not invasive for, it's not like people are, it's not like, I don't want to say, well, it's invasive because it's evil. It's not. It's, you've got people who believe that a certain way of living is going to contribute to greater well-being. And so they think that the laws can direct them to that. And so the police are going to be there to make sure that people follow the laws. As opposed to, say, if you were more of a small L liberal in terms of promoting individual freedom, and you also believed that the state, it's not the appropriate function of the state to police things like morality or direct people towards what is better or worse in the good life, you may see a far less invasive police force. You may see a police force that operated more like a fire department, where it's not that the police are actively looking for things, because look, individuals are going to do what they want. As long as someone's rights, or as long as someone's rights aren't being infringed by someone else, they're just going to let you do what you want. And so if I do something that starts infringing on your rights, then you're going to call the police and they're going to fix it, or we're going to resolve it ourselves. So I think that the major issue is the laws. And I'd have to think a little bit more as to what the police look like depending on those laws. Because just because you have, I don't want to say that just because you have, say, a state that's aligned with, say, small c conservative perfectionist views, that you're going to have an overbearing police force. Not necessarily. I need to think about that a little bit more. That's unsatisfying, I understand.
Well, that is the extreme, though. This sort of upper right corner extreme is Taliban, and the lower left extreme is more the firehouse police style.
It is, but, without causing too much controversy in the last 2 minutes of my session, once you go far enough on the right and far enough on the left, they kind of start looking very similar. So you see a lot what's happening on university campuses, and I very much appreciate the opening comments talking about the importance of free speech and the importance of discourse on campuses, but you hear stories from certain university campuses or certain college campuses where they're not the Taliban. In fact, it seems like they're sort of promoting individual values and freedom, but they've taken it so far that it ends up being this clamping down. So I think you can see a type of over-policing on both ends. But I need to think about that more, because you raise a very good point that the laws are going to change significantly, and I'm sure you see how the laws would change and the state involvement would change. But in terms of practice and how we would go about policing those things, it may be the case that I need to revise that, because it's not immediately obvious to me, sort of talking through this now, whether you would necessarily see a difference in policing. I think in practice, when we can identify the states that are more, say, conservative or more, say, theocratic, you have in practice a different type of policing than the ones that are more small L liberal and more democratic or whatever else. But it's not immediately obvious that it has to be that way. But that it is that way over and over again may suggest that there's something about those views that leads to that type of policing.
We find ourselves at the end of our first session. You're invited back when we reconvene at 12:30. But the only thing I need from you now is to help me thank our panel by doing this.